All right. I would like to welcome to the show Ruth Ben-Ghiat, author of, well, your most recent, oh, is she here?
Yes. Hi.
Oh, hi. How are you? Your most recent book is Strongmen, the rise and fall of authoritarians. I've seen a couple of different titles of your book, and it's gotten me confused a little bit.
It's because there's the UK edition that has the
Ah,
long subtitle, and the US is from Mussolini to the present.
okay. Well, there you go, and that gives a good description. Let's start just with this with why start with Mussolini.
Mussolini was the person who laid down the template. He laid down the foundation for authoritarian rule. And in fact, while he gets eclipsed by Hitler for good reasons, the way he actually took power is more relevant to what happens today, because he was appointed by the king, but he was a prime minister of a democracy for 3 years before he declared dictatorship to shut down a special investigation that would have put him in jail. Very
Huh.
contemporary.
I would say, yes, what's old is new again. Well, all right. So work out for us the taxonomy of authoritarians, of strongmen, of fascism, and maybe if you could also give us a definition of fascism and authoritarianism, so that we have a sense of just like, you know, there's a quality to this of all German shepherds are dogs, but all dogs are not German shepherds necessarily.
Exactly. Trying to be succinct because these are big questions. So
We've got plenty of time.
the book is a look at 100 years of authoritarianism, which is at its most basic, a political system in which the executive, the leader, asserts an outsized authority and comes to domesticate varying degrees the judiciary, the press, the courts, and often has a personality cult. And this has evolved over 100 years. Fascism is one phase of this. It's in the origins of it, along with communism. And fascism was a hyper-nationalist, one-party state with a leader cult, very expansionist in a way that authoritarians today are not. And there's many other things one could say about fascism. But the category of strongmen that I use in the book refers to these kinds of authoritarian leaders who have a personality cult. They do all the things, shutting down, or threatening the press, trying to domesticate the judiciary. They use these tools of propaganda, corruption, myths of national greatness, but they also use this tool of virility or hypermasculinity. And their relations with other male leaders, and so the first template is Hitler and Mussolini, are very important in setting foreign policy. So I'm trying to I integrate in a way that other studies don't, masculinity as a strategy of political legitimation.
Is it, with that said, and I think, people can apply a lot of what you're saying. Obviously, we have an example, a very easy example for us right now to sort of like apply some of these things. But is it possible can you have a strong woman? As opposed to a strong man, a leader?
You can. In past history, there have been plenty of female tyrants. And there were leaders who were very strong executive presences, from Golda Meir to Margaret Thatcher, nicknamed the Iron Lady, to Indira Gandhi. But I don't have them in my book because I'm really looking at people who severely damaged or destroyed democracy. And because I wanted to isolate this mostly 20th century, but going into the 21st century, fetish of male power and the cult of male force that ties all of these other tools together. So if you think about like corruption, the strong man is a man who gets away with breaking the law. He gets away with breaking rules, and that's why people love him. So that's another reason in the conclusion, I say that there in the future, I believe there will be a female authoritarian leader. There's a lot of figures in Europe and the European far right who are leaders who are female, but I wanted to look at what we've had until now, and so I concentrated on men.
I maybe we should circle back around to this after we go through a couple of the figures that you talk about. But I at the beginning of this pandemic, I interviewed a couple of epidemiologists, and one in particular, I asked, what is your greatest fear about this? And they said, my greatest fear is COVID 2022. And I guess to a certain extent, the some of the big questions I have regarding Donald Trump and his authoritarianism and his strongman is really more because I'm curious about the next one and what exists in our society. I mean, because you have, you go from the Seko from the Congo, Modi and Duterte and Pinochet and Franco, Berlusconi, obviously Orban and Erdogan. But I'm curious: are there the context for these different? Is there something? Are there specific, I guess, countries or societies that are more open or susceptible or seeking this type of leader?
It's a great question. And one of the lessons of doing this history that's a global history is that no country in the right circumstances is immune from the appeal of a strongman. Now, the outcome is going to be very different. And so, for example, because I've worked on fascism for so long, people are always pressing me to say, is Trump a fascist? Call him a fascist. And I don't do that. I like to leave fascism for the early 20th century. But one thing that is in common and these kind of patterns that the book brings out is that when there's been a period where there's been a lot of social change, a lot of social emancipation, it could be workers' rights, it could be progress in racial equality, same-sex marriages in our own day. There's a lot of emancipation going on. And this leaves many people profoundly anxious or wanting to turn this back. And these are the periods, so periods of great change and transition, in which these figures find favor. And they often come up, sometimes they're from outside the political system. They seem new and exciting. They promise to make the nation great again. And great again also means stopping these emancipatory processes, right? But every time they're able to get into power, it's because there's been this kind of change, and people cling to them as a kind of new a hero. They feel their heroes are disappearing. If you just think of like men are not men anymore. When Trump got the nomination, InfoWars, the far right, had said, "Oh, men will be men again under Trump."
Right. Well, so I mean, and I can see. I mean, certainly, and also, we won't have a black president anymore. Would be one of the things on the list that they would be excited about. But how much of it is a strictly? I mean, you mentioned workers' rights, but how much of it is a function of these type of like emancipatory movements, but also coupled with economic difficult economic times? I mean, for instance, the most emancipatory period of our society, it seems to me, would have taken place perhaps in Reconstruction and also in the 60s, right? I mean, where we had broad emancipation, both racial in many respects, and I mean, obviously not total, but and in terms of gender, and we didn't see something like that then, or did we?
No, we didn't have an African American president, and there is no discounting the fact that millions of people felt it was the end of what Stephen Miller says, Western civilization. They all talk about Western civilization. It's a code word. The affront of having Barack Obama as president, some people never got over it. And when people say that Obama lives in Trump's head, this is also common, that there's been a male leader who's very popular, and the strongman comes in and sees this as a rival. But yes, we had periods like the 60s, but they did not culminate in having a commander-in-chief and president who was African-American. And this was a line many thought should never have been crossed.
But when we look at, let's say, I mean, what were the, I mean, in obviously when we were talking about fascism and the rise of those authoritarian leaders, we were talking about a massive amount of economic deprivation, no?
Absolutely. And so the economic circumstances, mass unemployment. I mean, fascism started after World War I. And again, this was the template and also a reaction to the Russian Revolution, which had just happened. And so it was a very, very particular period in society. But what's very interesting are the the political manifestations and tools of rule that came out of this have endured. If you think of personality cults, Mussolini, along with Lenin and then Stalin, was the first to have a real personality cult. And the rules of those personality cults, how they work with propaganda, have actually not changed for a century. Even, of course, the people who have them change. So these are like these moments of, you could call them dysfunction because of economic difficulty, of vast change and instability. Some people see them as moments of celebration of progress, and some people see them as the end of everything. And this was the same in Spain in the early 30s before the coup that brought Francisco Franco to power. Women had been emancipated. They'd been a whole host of legal rights, and there was secularization. We can't forget about that, is also part of it. And so very often these leaders make deals with religious figures, religious institutions, regardless of how profane they personally are. So they shake up everything, but they serve to, as profoundly conservative influences in society.
And how much are the elite, and by that I mean obviously the economic elite, what kind of buy-in do they need in these instances?
And this is another pattern that, many of these men come from outside the system, and they depend on political and financial conservative elites to let them in. And so in the case of fascism, Italian fascism, because it's the first, was really interesting. So Mussolini gets invited in by the king, and he's propped up by the conservatives. They were called liberals, and so he had been a socialist, but he was certainly no socialist by the time he became prime minister. The first thing he does in 1923 is to privatize. So there's a sub-theme in the book of these strongmen who appeal to financial and business elites through privatization. So like we're talking the insurance industry, the telephone industry. So these are large-scale privatizations that he does immediately to keep the business class happy. And so this recurs over and over again, that without these elites, which are both financial and political, the strongman he can't get to power, and he can't consolidate power.
Let's talk about when we look at, we talk about this notion of like a coup. How has the ascendance to power of these type of figures, how has the dynamics of that changed, or has it?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question. And so, the book is divided into three periods, and it's the fascist era, the age of military coups, because a huge number of the strong men came in through coups. So I have Gaddafi, I have Pinochet, and Mobutu. And then we have the new authoritarian age. So after the end of the Cold War, when Soviet and US-backed coups became less common, you have the phenomenon of authoritarians getting in through elections. And the pioneer here was Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, who was, a business tycoon who owned television networks. He had a huge personality cult, and he was in through elections. And so today, there's many of the kind of ingredients in the authoritarian playbook have changed. There's less genocide, less public mass violence, more targeted violence like Putin has, more mass detention like Erdogan has. But you have a continuation of some of these things like the personality cult. And once they get in through elections, they have to manipulate elections to stay in power. And that's what Putin has done. And so when we look at Trump's attempts in this period to declare the results of our election as illegitimate, this goes, this has a lineage.
Well, so why have, I guess Hitler also attained power through election, right? But why is it that those, I'm looking at like even the coup that I think, many, including myself, would argue took place in Bolivia last year, was a softer coup than we have seen, let's say, Pinochet. What is it that has changed? That is what has changed? I guess that changes those different eras that you play out. What is happening with societies, or is there more stability being brought about by that elite class on some level, where I don't know, our economic interests, the corporations are now multinational, and so they're a little bit less inclined to have disruption of things, or what?
I think that's right. Certainly the Cold War, which came after fascism, sustained that whole goal. It's called the golden age of military coups. And when the Cold War ended, so did...
People call that the golden age of military coups?
Yes, in coup studies, the 60s and 70s were the golden age. Yes, it's a problematic term, but that's the term that's used. And I think what you said is correct. There's less tolerance with capitalism being so global. There's less tolerance for disruption. There's also the effect of social media. And I write about the attempted coup against Erdogan in Turkey in 2016, where Turkey had a lot of coups, both military coups and constitutional coups, of kind of soft coups in this way. But so these officers did many things right, but they didn't capture social media. They captured CNN Turk, and that was this very dramatic moment when Erdogan was on the run for, fearing for his life, and he got on via FaceTime. And so the anchor held up her iPhone with his little face, and this was very important to him, seeming like a besieged figure, and he asked Turks to go out and save him and save the nation. And the coup hugely helped his popularity. But the coupists were not able to shut down social media. And so all over YouTube and other platforms and Facebook, there were damaging images of the violence that the coup was causing. And this caused public opinion to turn against them. So this is why it's harder these days to pull off a military coup.
And instead it's more of, it is, I guess, I feel, and I don't want to make it seem like we're necessarily out of the woods. I think Donald Trump has shown time and time again that both there's a considerable amount of incompetence in just about everything he does. But it also, he seems less inclined to consolidate power at times. Like, for instance, we could compare his reaction to COVID to maybe Bolsonaro's, who he doesn't seem to be using this as an opportunity. He's almost disaggregating power on some level in the context of COVID. What accounts for that, or is he really? He seems like a really weak strongman in some respects. I mean, just he has less. In other words, he's not looking to consolidate power as much as he is. He's just sort of like has an agenda that rips through norms on some level.
You know, the issue with calling him a weak strongman or a semi-failure is that what is the standard we're using? Because I hear this all the time. You know, people write to me and say, you're crazy. He's not Putin. He's not Orban. But Putin and Orban started somewhere. Like Putin's been there for 20 years. Orban's been there for a long time. Erdogan had himself appointed both president and prime minister, and he had the coup. That was there are these shock events, and that's one of them. And so Trump is just getting started. And another way to see this is that if we view him through the lens of democratic presidents, then he looks strange. But his aims have never been those of democratic presidents. He's not interested in public welfare, public goods. He's not interested in, again, the welfare of his people. He couldn't care less. That's why he gave up on COVID. His aims have always been to make money for the Trump organization and to build his personality cult. That's why he keeps having rallies, which, again, makes no sense by most logics to have rallies and further spread the pandemic. But his ego needs and his needs to keep his following far outweigh those. And he also does want to stay in power as long as possible. And now he has the perfect co-conspirators. So I talk about this in my book, of William Barr and Secretary of State Pompeo, who dutifully went in front of the cameras, the latter, and said, oh, yes, we'll have a transition to a second Trump administration. And the other thing to say about Trump is, whereas, and this is where his historical perspective puts him, it's interesting to look at him through this lens, that many leaders who had success in domesticating parties, they had founded those parties, like Berlusconi with Forza Italia, or Mussolini, or they'd been in a position of leadership in their parties, like Orban, for a really long time. Trump just came in from outside. And in 4 short years, he's wrapped that party around his finger so that they acquitted him at the Senate trial. Their 2020 party platform was like, dear leader, we're just supporting Trump. Right. And they're sticking with him even now. Only a few senators are going against this pretty naked power grab. So I see him as extremely successful at the things that he cared about most, which is loyalty, and making money for Trump organization.
Well, I mean, but he also, I mean, knock on wood, it appears he failed at maintaining power.
Yes, he did fail. And I don't think ultimately he's going to succeed in staying in power. I'm not using some people are using the word that there's a coup going on. There's an attempt to use every means possible to try. And legal means, and Donald Trump's mode of operation has always been to find loopholes in tax and regulatory and financial right. and in legal structures. That's how he operates. And again, he's got Barr there. And of course, he stacked the Supreme Court so that if it came to that, which there's precedents for, using the courts, letting courts decide things. So he was voted out, but the key thing is to look at how he's reacting now. He's not conforming to a Democratic playbook. He's refusing to even accept the results.
Right. All right. So where does that leave us in terms of like the history of post strong men? Like, I mean, it's almost as if and because let's just assume that things continue on this trajectory, right? Where you have Langford saying, we got to get Joe Biden right into this, but not because he's going to be the president, but just in case he becomes the president, which is, maybe in some respects more reprehensible that he's, sort of like playing along with
he's hedging.
Right. But let's assume, because it's a totally different interview if Donald Trump actually doesn't leave the office, and we don't know what that, but let's assume that he does. Sometime in December, he begrudgingly says, yeah, maybe, whatever. In fact, I don't want to do this anymore. Michael Cohen says he's going to go to Mar-a-Lago for Christmas, and he's just not going to come back for the next like 3 weeks, which actually sounds like exactly, what I would imagine him doing. But what happens when that's the way a strong man goes out? Or I guess maybe more generically, what happens to a society after a strong man? Like, is there,
Yeah.
there are, I don't know, 30 million evangelicals, maybe more, who voted for him, 70 million people who voted for him, who, not all of them, but a significant percentage of those people see this guy as dear leader, as opposed to just a guy who gave us good tax cuts and is a businessman, et cetera, et cetera. What happens to those people after the fact? And how does the fact that Trump sort of like skulks away, does that drain the energy out of that authoritarian impulse and I'm talking authoritarian in terms of the followers?
Yes.
Or does it keep a significant potential there that Tom Cotton could come up and pick up and walk with?
Or Donald Trump in 2024, because he plays with, because they always have to be campaigning. They have to have a cause. I mean, Michael Cohen's been right about, everything he's said, because he knows his subject. But we always have to remember that for regular Democratic presidents, the prospect of leaving office is a time to think about their legacy. For someone like Donald Trump, and unfortunately, his psychology checks every box of all the leaders that I've studied. The outcome's different. It's not a fascist outcome. But it's like a psychological annihilation for them to leave office. They can't imagine life without being adulated and having power to humiliate others. So that's why it's very difficult, and many of them meet a bad end. Now, when you think of somebody, the only one who was voted out of office was Pinochet in Chile. And he had over a year before he actually left office after the vote. And he tried to sabotage the new democracy as much as possible because they're very vindictive. And so he stacked the Supreme Court. Have you seen a lot of, in Trump world, you've seen a lot of movements of personnel, top positions being reshuffled. Authoritarianism is about the lack of accountability. And Donald Trump's always been about secrecy and lack of accountability. So he's trying to protect his secrets. He's getting I call it the end stage follies. I made a little video for Twitter about end stage follies. And so they're trying to do damage control here. But what he will leave is what happened also in Chile and Spain after Franco. And I'm not saying these are analogous because things work differently today. But he'll leave a deeply divided nation. And it's going to take us a very long time to heal from that polarization. But I predict that whatever role he has, he has to keep this polarization going, because the cult of victimhood, Trump's victimhood, is the foundational myth of the Trump world, that he's a victim. And he must keep this going to save face, no matter what he actually does.
In fact, I think there was reporting today that he's already talking about creating some type of digital media empire.
Yes. Truly, it's hard for people who don't have this psychology. And it was not fun to immerse myself for 2 years in these guys' heads. But you cannot underestimate the strength of their personality cult. And when you look at Berlusconi was finally forced out of office because of the Eurozone crisis and this massive sex scandal with underage, women and all these things. And he was not allowed to run for office as part of his punishment, although he never went to jail. But the next time elections came around in 2013, his party almost won again. And this was his party. It had the same relation as Trump has the GOP, wrapped around his finger. So even though they leave office, the attachments that they've formed, the leader-follower relationship, it's really hard to dissolve it.
Is that a function of Trump or of the followers? I mean, I've been, for 4 or 5 years now, I've been trying to get Bob Altemeyer, who you may be familiar with, who has done the sort of the clinical research on this, and we're talking about maybe he'll come on and discuss it. But he when he says authoritarian, he's talking about the followers. And he had
Mm-hmm.
said, 10, 15 years ago, 25% of North Americans are authoritarians.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just waiting on some level, lying dormant, waiting for somebody to show up, and Trump shows up. Are they now in a sort of like a hyperactive state so that the next person who comes by doesn't even have to have necessarily the same attributes that Trump has? But is their hunger satiated or aroused, I guess, is my question.
It's hard to know this. I totally agree. And this is the line I take in my book, that the GOP was already drifting in an authoritarian direction. And many Americans were identifying more with kind of wanted strong leadership. And this is, again, back to the discourse of Obama, who was constantly feminized and treated as a weak ruler, to the extent that we have not assessed, his military actions, all the drones, in the way that we might in the future. But it's a very special blend of, I call it seduction and threat, that these showmen have. And so nobody is going to do it quite like Trump. And part of their appeal is that, on the one hand, they're bullies. On the other hand, they are very vulnerable and open and emotional. And Trump talks about, I love you. I love the leader of North Korea. He doesn't salute the flag. I have a picture in my book. He hugs the flag, which you're not supposed to do. But again, no boundaries. And so people feel very protective of these leaders, even though they're also bullies. It's a very complex masculinity. And also they're constantly whining, the victims and poor me. And this runs counter to traditional notions of virility, of the strong and silent type. Donald Trump is not strong and silent. He's whiny, but it makes people feel attached to them. So to answer your question, someone else could come along and marshal those energies for law and order. And a lot of people, this is what concerns me, people like Barr and others have invested a lot because they have a long-term agenda, and everybody's is a little bit different. Barr's is also to decrease secularization, separation of church and state, et cetera. But they don't want to give this up. They've come so far and they were almost ready to consolidate, and now they have to give it up. So they could revive this with somebody else, but that person isn't going to have the degree of charismatic bond with the followers that Trump does, because Trump is a unique individual in that way. He comes from reality TV.
Right.
So
they may have to
Trump.
resort to maybe more explicit mechanisms once they get in the position of doing that, because they don't have that sort of softer allure, I guess.
That's right. And that's why these men are kind of not unique, but they have a very specific temperament, and they're all the same. They all whine about being victims. They're all irascible. They're all impulsive. The way their governments are, a revolving door of people getting fired. So I have these. This is why the historical perspective is really useful. So they all like to humiliate people when they fire them. So Mussolini's party head, a very big position, found out by reading in the newspaper that he was fired. And then Mobutu used to hold rallies, and everybody had to be there sitting, and he would announce who was fired. So you're finding out in front of all your peers. And then we have Rex Tillerson, the first Secretary of State, who was seated on the toilet scrolling through Twitter and found out via tweet that he had been fired. But the mechanism of humiliation so that they feel more important is the same.
Tillerson didn't have to let us know about that fact, about exactly where he was. But Ruth Ben-Ghiat, the book is Mussolini to the Present. Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.